I'm 63 years old, and if anyone had told me that falling in love again would be the most dangerous thing I ever did, I would have smiled and changed the subject. I'd spent 31 years building something real, something mine, and I almost handed it to a stranger because I confused loneliness with love. But I didn't. And the reason I didn't comes down to one decision I made before the wedding, a decision I never told my husband or his two daughters about, a decision that 3 years later saved everything. Let me back up. In 1991, I was 32 years old, recently divorced, raising my daughter alone on a teacher's salary, and I bought a failing flower farm in the hill country outside Fredericksburg, Texas. 22 acres of rocky limestone soil and a collapsing greenhouse that hadn't turned a profit in 6 years. My mother thought I'd lost my mind. My ex-husband actually called to make sure I hadn't. The bank loan officer, a man named whatever his name was, who I will never forget, looked at my application and then looked at me and said slowly, like he was explaining something to a child, "Miss Aldridge, do you have any idea what you're getting into?" I did not. That's the honest answer. What I had was stubbornness and a specific vision. I'd grown up watching my grandmother tend her garden in the hill country, and I believed there was a market for something the big commercial growers weren't doing: small batch specialty cut flowers, heirloom varieties, the kind of blooms you couldn't find at a grocery store. Peonies and ranunculus and chocolate cosmos and lisianthus and colors that stop people in their tracks. The first 2 years were brutal. I was teaching fifth grade during the week and working the fields on weekends with my daughter, who was 9 and small enough to crawl under the irrigation lines to fix the clogs. She thought it was an adventure. I knew we were one bad season from losing everything, but I didn't tell her that. By 1997, I had my first wholesale account with a boutique florist in Austin. By 2002, I had 12 accounts and had expanded to 40 acres. By 2008, Aldrich Hill Farm had a website, a thriving farm stand operation, and was supplying flowers to 3 wedding venues in the Texas Hill Country. By 2015, we were at 82 acres. I had a small event barn I'd built with a contractor friend, and the farm had been featured in Texas Monthly twice. Do you know what it takes to build something like that as a single woman in rural Texas? The summers when the heat cracked the earth and you lost entire beds overnight. The late frosts that wiped out 3 weeks of work in a single night. The years when the wholesale prices dropped and you had to pivot fast or fold. Every acre of that farm, every greenhouse, every irrigation line. I planned it, financed it, built it, and paid for it, alone, with my own 2 hands and 31 years of stubbornness. When my daughter graduated from Texas A&M with a degree in agriculture and came back to help run the business, I cried for about a week straight. Not sad crying, the other kind. The kind that comes when you realize something you built actually lasted. By the time I turned 62, the farm was valued at somewhere between $6 and $8 million, depending on who was asking and why. I had a manager, a small full-time staff, and enough of a reputation in the regional floriculture market that I could, finally, breathe. My daughter ran the wholesale accounts. I still made the creative decisions, walked the fields every morning, decided what we planted and when. I was also, for the first time in a very long time, aware of how quiet the farmhouse was at night. I met him at a charity gala in San Antonio, one of those wine and auction evenings where the cause is good and the conversation is better than I expected. He was 68, a retired civil engineer who'd spent his career on infrastructure projects across the Southwest. Silver-haired, physically fit in the way that comes from decades of outdoor work, with an easy laugh and the kind of manners that suggested he'd been raised to hold doors and mean it. He asked me what I did. I told him I grew flowers. He said that was the most interesting answer he'd heard all evening and asked if he could come see the farm sometime. He visited the following month. He walked every row of the peony beds like he was memorizing them. He asked intelligent questions about soil chemistry and irrigation schedules. He stayed for dinner, and we talked until 11 o'clock on the porch, watching the fireflies come up over the east field. I told myself to be careful. I'd been alone for a long time, and I knew what loneliness did to judgment. but he was patient. He didn't push. We dated for 11 months before he brought up anything serious, and when he finally did, when he said he wanted to think about a future together, he did it gently, without pressure, giving me room to say no. I didn't say no. What I did say eventually was yes to an engagement. And then, quietly, without telling anyone, I made a phone call. I called my attorney, a woman I'd worked with since 2003, who had helped me through 2 business restructurings and one very contentious contract dispute with a wholesale buyer who thought he could just stop paying invoices. She'd seen me fight before. She knew how I operated. I told her I was getting engaged. I told her I wanted a prenuptial agreement that was airtight. I told her every asset I had acquired before this marriage, every acre, every greenhouse, every piece of equipment, every business account was to remain my separate property, period, full stop, no exceptions. She said, of course. What else? I said, I also want to think carefully about what I tell him about the structure of the farm's ownership. She paused. What do you mean? I've been thinking about this for weeks. There was something, I couldn't name it precisely, it was an instinct more than a logic, that made me want to keep the full picture to myself for a little while longer. Not forever, not as a permanent deception, just long enough to see what happened when we were actually living as a married couple, long enough to see who people showed you they really were. I'm not going to lie to him directly, I told her, but I'm not going to go out of my way to explain that I'm the sole owner of an $8 million property. If he asks, I'll be vague. I'll let people assume there are family trusts involved, other stakeholders, complexity. I want to see how he behaves when he doesn't think there's a clear path to the asset. My attorney was quiet for a moment. Kathy, that's either very wise or very cynical. Probably both, I said. I should tell you something about his daughters before I go further, because they matter to this story more than he did in some ways. He had 2 from his first marriage. His first wife had passed away from cancer 8 years earlier. The older one was 41, a property manager in Houston. The younger was 37, and she worked in financial services in Dallas. They were polished, educated, pleasant at the engagement dinner my daughter hosted, and they asked questions I didn't quite like. Not rudely. That's what I want to be clear about. They were never rude. It was the texture of the questions. The older one walked the farm like she was calculating square footage. She asked about the event barn. What was its capacity? Did I use it year-round? What did a full wedding package cost? The younger one asked about the business structure. Was it an LLC? Did I have partners? Who handled the legal and financial side? I gave vague answers. It's always been a family operation. The structure is a little complicated. My attorney handles most of that. They smiled and nodded and didn't push, but I noticed them exchanging a look when they thought I wasn't watching. I told my daughter about it that night after they'd all gone back to their hotels. She'd been watching them at dinner and said, "Mom, those questions were not normal future stepdaughter questions." I know, sweetheart. Did you get the prenup? I did. Does he know the full ownership picture? Not exactly. She looked at me for a long moment. My daughter has my eyes and her grandmother's ability to say a lot without speaking. Finally, she said, "Good." We were married that spring. A small ceremony at the farm under the pergola in the east garden that was covered in clematis. I'd grown from cuttings. It was beautiful, genuinely beautiful. He cried when he saw me walk toward him, and I believed those tears were real. I still believe that, actually. I think he did love me in his way. That doesn't excuse what came later, but I think it's important to be honest about the complexity. The first year was good. He was a considerate companion. He cooked on Sundays, took a genuine interest in the mechanics of the farm, fixed things that had been broken for years because I'd never had time to deal with them. He'd been an engineer. He understood systems, and a flower farm is nothing but systems. Irrigation, drainage, climate control in the greenhouses, soil amendment schedules. He offered suggestions that were sometimes actually useful, and I told him so. His daughters visited for holidays. Things felt, if not entirely comfortable, then functional. Civil, like two separate families learning the choreography of being connected. In year 2, it started. The older one called me one afternoon while her father was out. She'd been thinking, she said, about the farm's insurance situation. Had I had a comprehensive appraisal recently? With the real estate market the way it was, and the added structures, the barn, the new greenhouse I'd built in 2019, the coverage I had might not reflect current replacement value. She knew a firm that could do a full appraisal. Family discount, she said. She'd be happy to set it up. I thanked her and said I'd think about it. 2 weeks later, the younger one was at the farm for a weekend visit. She mentioned over breakfast that she'd been reading about estate planning for agricultural properties. Had I thought about putting the farm into a family trust, it would simplify things enormously, she said. From a tax perspective, from a transition perspective, she could connect me with an estate attorney she trusted. I already had an estate attorney. I told her so pleasantly. She smiled. Of course, I just want to make sure you're protected. We're family now. I thought about my grandmother's expression for someone who smiles with their mouth while their eyes are somewhere else entirely. Then my husband started asking me to sign things. The first time, it was a form for updating the beneficiary on a life insurance policy. His, not mine. Reasonable. I signed it. The second time, it was a document that he described as a simplified power of attorney, just in case something happened to one of us. I read it carefully. It wasn't simplified, and it wasn't limited to emergency circumstances. It was a broad authorization that would have given him significant control over financial and property decisions. I put it down on the kitchen table and looked at him. I'm not signing this, sweetheart. This is much broader than what you described. He looked hurt. I thought we were partners. We are. The partners also read things before they sign them. He went quiet for 3 days. Cold, not angry. The kind of quiet that's designed to make you feel like you've done something wrong. I'd been a self-employed woman in a male-dominated industry for 3 decades. I knew that particular silence. I didn't apologize. The documents kept appearing, a financial account consolidation form that would have added his name to my business accounts, a property transfer document. This one I caught because I happened to look at it carefully before he could explain what it was, and I recognized the parcel numbers. Those were my numbers, the farm's numbers. I called my attorney from my car parked at the end of the driveway where I couldn't be heard. She said, "Kathy, how many of these have there been?" 4, I told her. Over about 6 months. Have you signed any of them? No. Good. Don't sign anything else until I can look at it. And I want to do a county record search right now. She called me back in 4 days. Her voice had a specific quality I'd heard once before, when she told me a wholesale buyer had filed for bankruptcy while owing me $60,000. Someone has filed partnership documents with the county, she said, documents that appear to add your husband and his older daughter as co-owners of Aldridge Hill Farm, LLC. I sat down on the porch steps. The signatures on those documents don't match your signature on file, she said. Not even close. Whoever did this wasn't careful. I asked her what we needed to do. She said, police report, injunction, forensic document analysis, and she paused. Kathy, before we do any of that, I think you should know who you married. I already had a suspicion. I'd hired an investigator 6 weeks earlier, quietly, because the document requests had started to feel like a pattern rather than carelessness. A woman I'd been referred to through a business contact, someone who specialized in financial fraud cases. She came back to me the week after my attorney called. His first wife had not died of cancer. She had died of cancer, yes, but in the 2 years before her death, while she was ill and increasingly dependent on him, she had signed over her retirement accounts, her investment portfolio, and a partial interest in the family home to him directly. Her sister had contested the transfers after the death, claiming she had not been mentally competent to make those decisions. The case had settled quietly. The sister received a small sum. He retained everything. His business partner from his engineering firm had filed a civil suit against him in 2009, alleging that he had manipulated the partnership agreement to redirect fees to himself. That case had also settled. His partner had signed a non-disclosure agreement as part of the settlement. The older daughter had lost her property management license in New Mexico over misappropriation of client funds. She was operating in Texas under a different business name. The investigator looked at me across the table at the coffee shop where we met, the same coffee shop I'd been going to since 2001, where everyone knew my name and my order, and she said, "This is not the first time they've done something like this." I drove back to the farm. I parked at the top of the ridge, where on clear days you can see across 4 counties of Texas hill country, all rolling limestone and cedar, and the silver threads of creeks moving through the draws. I'd stood in that spot 100 times. The view had always steadied me. I sat there for about an hour. Then I called my attorney and told her I wanted to build a case. Not just a divorce, a real case. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy. I wanted criminal charges filed. I wanted this documented on record, publicly, so that whoever they tried this on next would have something to find when they searched his name. She said it would be hard. I said I'd been doing hard things for 31 years. Let's get started. We spent 2 months building it. My attorney brought in a forensic accountant and a document examiner. The examiner confirmed the county filings were forgeries. The signature on the partnership documents was a copy of my actual signature, photocopied and overlaid, done poorly. The forensic accountant found email exchanges between my husband and his older daughter discussing the farm's estimated value and the timeline for the transition. There were text messages referencing how long before she can be persuaded, meaning me, presumably, meaning how long before I sign something I shouldn't. There was one email from the younger daughter that I have never fully been able to put out of my mind. She had written to her father asking if the farm's event barn was included in the primary parcel or assessed separately. This was 8 days after their first visit to the farm. 8 days in, she was already thinking about what would be hers. I want to be honest with you. This was one of the hardest things I have ever processed. Not the legal battle. The legal battle was almost straightforward once we had the evidence. The hard part was the grief. Because I had wanted this. I had wanted companionship. I had wanted someone to sit with me on the porch in the evenings and watch the fireflies and share a meal that I hadn't prepared alone. And some of what I'd had in the first year had felt like exactly that. Real, warm, the grief of understanding it had been calculated from the beginning. That took me longer than anything else to work through. My daughter knew something was happening because she knows me. I told her everything the week before I moved. I'd been quietly moving important documents, business records, financial account credentials to secure locations. I'd had the farm's locks changed on a Tuesday when he was in San Antonio. He came home to find the locks changed and a letter from my attorney on the front steps. 2 days later, Detective, I'll call her the detective from Gillespie County, executed a search warrant on his personal vehicle and the storage unit he rented in town. They found documents, blank forms with my signature already copied onto them, a folder with the farm's parcel numbers, the legal descriptions, the names of my accounts, a second folder with notes on comparable property sales in the hill country, annotated with what appeared to be projected timelines for various scenarios. They arrested him on a Friday morning. The older daughter was arrested the same day in Houston. The younger daughter, who had apparently had concerns about how far things had gone, had spoken to an attorney 2 weeks prior and had agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced charge. I did not plan a dinner. I did not arrange a dramatic confrontation. I have seen enough of those stories to know that they are satisfying to imagine and exhausting to live. What I did was stand in the East Peony field on the morning of the arrests, with the dew still on the foliage and the light coming sideways through the cedar trees at the perimeter, and I let myself feel every single thing I needed to feel. Then I went inside and made a pot of coffee and called my daughter. The criminal case moved on its own schedule, as those things do. His attorney tried several approaches. None of them worked particularly well once the forensic evidence was presented. He pleaded guilty to fraud and forgery to avoid trial. He received 4 years. Given his age and the nature of the charges, his attorney argued for minimum security. The court was not especially moved by that argument. The older daughter pleaded guilty to conspiracy and fraud. 2.5 years. She lost her Texas business registration as part of the plea terms. The younger daughter's cooperation resulted in probation and community service. I don't have uncomplicated feelings about that outcome, but I understand it was necessary. The divorce was finalized before the criminal case concluded. The prenuptial agreement held exactly as written. He received nothing from me. Not 1 acre, not 1 greenhouse, not 1 heirloom peony variety. His legal costs were substantial. His first wife's sister contacted me after the story became local news. She'd been fighting the transfer of her sister's estate for years with no traction. With our case on record, with the established pattern of behavior documented, she reopened her civil claim. I don't know yet how that will resolve, but I know she has better ground to stand on than she did before. I am 65 now. The farm is as beautiful as it has ever been. My daughter runs the wholesale operation and has expanded our accounts into New Mexico and Colorado. I walk the fields every morning before the crew arrives, the same way I have done since 1993, checking the beds, checking the irrigation, making the small decisions that only I know to make because I am the one who has been here for every season. I did not tell him, when we were married, that I was the sole owner of an $8 million agricultural property. I let him believe it was complicated. Family trusts, multiple stakeholders, nothing clear-cut. I maintain that vagueness deliberately and without apology. Some people, when they hear this story, say I should have trusted him, that keeping information from a spouse is a kind of dishonesty. Here is what I believe. Protecting what you have built is not a failure of trust. It is a recognition that trust is something that has to be earned across time, not assumed because someone has signed a document with you. And the person you believe someone to be on your wedding day may not be who they actually are. The only way to know who someone actually is, truly know, is to watch what they do when they think they know what they're dealing with. He thought he knew what he was dealing with. A 62-year-old woman, alone, running a flower farm, hungry for company, maybe a little soft because loneliness had made her that way. He did not know what he was dealing with, not even close. I still grow the same varieties my grandmother taught me to love. The chocolate cosmos, the lisianthus, the peonies that take 3 years to produce their first bloom and then give you decades. Things that take time. Things that reward patience and attention, and the willingness to stay with something through all the difficult seasons until it finally becomes what it was always going to be. Every morning I walk out into those fields and I touch the things I planted, and they are mine. Every root, every row, every bloom, mine. Because I knew what I had, and I protected it, and I did not let anyone take it from me. Not ever. There's a particular kind of quiet that comes after something is over. Not the hollow quiet of loss, but the settled quiet of a thing finally resolved. I know that quiet now. I feel it every morning when I walk out into the peony beds before the crew arrives, when the dew is still on the leaves and the light hasn't fully committed to the day yet. It's the quiet of a woman who did not lose what she spent 31 years building and who understands exactly why she didn't. What happened to me wasn't random bad luck, and it wasn't the universe punishing me for wanting companionship at 63. What happened was a direct consequence of choices, his choices and mine. His choices were dishonest, and they produced a dishonest outcome: arrest, conviction, loss of everything he tried to take. My choices: the prenuptial agreement, the deliberate vagueness about ownership, the decision to read every document before signing it, produced a different outcome. I kept my farm. I kept my freedom. The relationship between what you do and what happens to you is rarely neat or immediate, but it is real. I watched it play out over 3 years with a clarity that still sometimes startles me. I think about the woman I was when I bought those first 22 acres in 1991. 32 years old, recently divorced, genuinely uncertain whether I was making the worst mistake of my life. What I had then wasn't money or experience or anyone's encouragement. What I had was the willingness to do what was right even when it was hard, the honesty to assess my situation clearly without flinching away from bad news, and the stubbornness to keep going when every season gave me a new reason to quit. Those three things built the farm. And 31 years later, those same three things, that same moral compass, that same clear eyed judgment, that same refusal to be worn down, are exactly what saved it. I am not the kind of person who believes life is fair in any simple sense. I have watched good people suffer losses they didn't deserve, but I do believe that over time, integrity tends to be load bearing. You build your life on it, and when the pressure comes, and the pressure always comes eventually, it holds. Cutting corners on your own honesty, your own judgment, your own courage, those cuts tend to widen under stress. That's what I saw in him. A man who had learned to find shortcuts around other people's trust instead of building something real of his own. And in the end, he had nothing that could hold. My daughter asked me once after it was all over whether I was angry. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. I told her, not really, not anymore. What I feel mostly is clear. Clear about what I have, clear about what it costs to build it, and clear about what I'm willing to do to protect it. That clarity is not bitterness. It's the exact opposite of bitterness. It's what you get when you've been tested and you didn't collapse. I still walk these fields every morning. I still make every blending decision for the seasonal arrangements, still decide what we plant and when. The farm is mine, every root, every row, every bloom that opens in June, and I am still here, still growing things, still exactly as stubborn as I need to be.